This is Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs, editor of Tradition, with a new episode of our podcast. Subscribers to our journal have already received and have started discussing and debating our most recent fall 2020 issue, containing a symposium on Jewish thought in the contemporary world, educational challenges and goals. Molly Brofsky, our guest editor of this expansive and fascinating symposium, writes by way of introduction, "Meaning and complexity are the two essential values that lie at the heart of learning Jewish thought, Machshevet Yisrael. These two concepts are central to an individual's living a purposeful life, as well as our creating a thriving culture and society. The search for truth and meaning shapes the discipline, as well as the attempt to cut to the core ideas upon which we build our values, our interpersonal interactions, our communities, and our culture. But this endeavor cannot be achieved without the second principle, complexity, which serves as the tool enabling this discovery of truth and meaning through intellectual excavation and thoughtful sharpening of ideas." Molly continues, "Now, more than ever, the serious study of Jewish thought, both for its content, the serious exploration of intellectual, ethical, religious, and spiritual values and ideas, and for the critical skills it engenders, is invaluable. It is inspiring to see that so many contemporary teachers are considering these issues with thoughtfulness, dedication, and commitment." In the symposium, 11 wide-ranging entries were authored by some of today's leading thinkers, educators, and academics in North America and in Israel. I'll take this moment to thank Molly, herself a distinguished pedagogue in the field of Jewish thought, faculty member at Michlelet Mevaseret Yerushalayim, and a social worker in private practice. In this podcast, Molly meets with two of the authors. Rabbi David Bashevkin is the Director of Education for NCSY and an instructor at Yeshiva University. He recently published Synagogue, Sin and Failure in Jewish Thought. And Dr. Daniel Reinhold is Professor of Jewish Philosophy and the Dean of Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Yeshiva University. His most recent book, co-authored with Michael Harris, is Nietzsche, Soloveitchik, and Contemporary Jewish Philosophy, which was reviewed in our pages in summer 2019. Here's their conversation.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this edition of the Tradition podcast. I'm very excited to be here with Dr. Reinhold, Dr. Daniel Reinhold, and Rabbi Dr. David Bashevkin. The topic that I wanted to discuss, based on the symposium that both of you contributed to so wonderfully. I also want to thank you, and I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the symposium contributors. I think everybody did such a wonderful job, and thank God we ended up with a really well-rounded symposium. I wanted to ask you the following question. So the questions that were asked to the contributors, we asked about three major issues. One is, how broadly do you define Machshevet Yisrael? And I would say, Rabbi Bashevkin, that was something that you focused on, I thought, quite interestingly. The second question we asked was, what was your personal journey with Machshevet Yisrael? And Dr. Reinhold, I think that was, you were one of the people who discussed that. I think yours was actually called My Personal Jewish Philosophical Odyssey, and I found it quite fascinating. And the third question that we asked was, what are the contemporary issues that you think Machshevet Yisrael is poised to answer today? What do you identify as contemporary issues, and do you believe that Machshevet Yisrael can answer them? That's really what I'm interested in hearing from you about, and maybe talking about with you together. I actually found the symposium very interesting in this way. I think that there were people who were very specific about areas that they found to be topical to them. We had Miriam Feldman Kay, who's an expert in postmodernism, so she addressed postmodernism. We had Dr. Julie Goldstein, who very much teaches from an academic perspective. So she was arguing that it was her academic background and training that enabled her to address the uniquely modern issues of today. Cheryl Berman basically said, I'm calling upon educators to be like, her examples were the Rambam and Soloveitchik, who used Jewish philosophy in unique ways in their time to address the challenges of their time. Rabbi Ruderblank, I think, and maybe Rabbi Blau, and perhaps Dr. Schatz. Dr. Schatz also talked about a broad range of responses, but I would say certainly the first two, very much it sounded like culled from traditional sources and felt like the answers are in our traditional sources, even if they need to be updated. But I find this to be a really interesting and real life question. I find it quite fascinating. What are the challenges that we face? How do we see them with our students or our constituents or whoever it is that you're interacting with? Does Machshav Yisrael have the answers? And if so, did I mention Rabbi Singer? Obviously, Rabbi Dov Singer.
Did you mention Yosef Bronstein?
Yeah, Yosef Bronstein. Yes, Yosef Bronstein. Dr. Reinhold and Yosef, he's his doctorate. I think he's also Rabbi.
Yeah, Yosef
he's doctor. Yeah, he was a doctorate.
So those were both the most autobiographical pieces, and I found them quite moving. And they also resonated with me very much. I think most people who find themselves in Jewish philosophy have a journey, and I think they demonstrate this lived description of what we're talking about, how it really changed their lives. Dr. Reinhold, it really changed your life. You were going to go into mathematics. Yes. So it's a very alive issue. We've talked about how it's alive for you. Do you find it alive in the life of your students? What I was going to say is, Rav Dov, for him, it's all neo-Chassidut, right? And he has this radical approach, which is, it's sort of, I'd like to hear, Rabbi, what you think about this. He was like, don't teach Jewish philosophy, live Jewish philosophy, right? His neo-Chassidut. Okay, I think I've given enough of a broad introduction. I'd be happy to hear how you feel about this question, how you address this question, where you come, what angle you would take when thinking about these issues. So I guess, Dr. Reinhold, since you're at the top of my screen,
okay, so I have to say I'm wary, speaking as somebody who teaches Jewish philosophy and writes about Jewish philosophy for a living, effectively, about how much power to give it. On the one hand, I do think that in an age where we are surrounded by critical thought and people are given to critical thought and self-reflection, I think that it's almost inevitable. I also think that Jewish philosophy is kind of unavoidable. Even for people who have never officially studied any philosophy formally. There are certain things that trickle down. Everybody does Jewish philosophy as soon as they say that, Hashem doesn't have a body, for example, right? Which is something that came down ultimately and became an absolute. If you ask that now, I think in any room of Jews, like, does God have any kind of body or bodily form? I imagine you'd probably get everybody saying no, and anybody who didn't would maybe be looked at strangely. But that's ultimately something that became a given due to effectively the Rambam. So I think it's inevitable. B, we live in an era where everybody is given to critical thought. We're very kind of, we have almost an intellectual conscience that doesn't allow us to just take things as read. So at that level, I think it's unavoidable. I think it gives us tools for answering questions, or at least thinking about questions. Philosophers are notorious for being pretty hopeless at giving answers. They're still arguing about things that were first raised in the days of Plato, and we still don't have the answers. But what I do think that Jewish philosophy has and can maybe ideally model is respectful discussion between people who disagree on various issues, but are bound nonetheless by a shared identity, community, whatever it might be. And to be honest, right now, that does seem a really pressing issue, just to be able to still have lunch with friends with whom you disagree. And I think, Jewish philosophy really does model that, in as much as we have people who we as Jews all cite as our great forebears, and often they would barely agree on a single philosophical tenet. And to me, that's an important thing. And one other thing I'll say before I'll see to Rabbi Beshevkin is that right now, there was, I think, a time when Jewish philosophy would have been less significant to the world because of its particularity. But we're living now, I think, in an era where particularism has kind of been trendy for a while now, frankly, in philosophical circles post-Enlightenment. But particularly now, where kind of people speak of having an identity and having certain experiences and philosophies and whatever it might be that emerge from those identities, and that's something that is very much a part of the world in which we live. It seems to me that we can and should proudly tout our own without shame, embarrassment, or apologetics. But like I say, maybe in a way that will model respectful debate between those different particularities.
Yeah, it's funny that Dr. Reinhold, Dean Reinhold, my teacher, who I studied a great deal with, ended on that note. That's really where I wanted to begin. I think that we are living in a moment in history that is so ripe for an immersion in the rich substance and culture of what Jewish thought, machshava, whatever you call it. You know, I took some swipes at some of the names in my opening, but I think now is a very rich moment. And I think it's a rich moment for two reasons. Number one, kind of just in the popular zeitgeist in the world, as we've become more computerized, digitized, as we've become more technologically immersed, the question of, so what makes human beings unique? What is the human condition? What makes us any different than computers? I think for centuries we were asking what makes us different than animals, and we're competing with somebody else now. But the questions, I think, are much more interesting, whether it's like philosophers like a Nick Bostrom or Yuval Harari. I mean, just you go into an airport and the books are talking about things like singularity, about a messianic redemption by computers, about considering that the world is all an illusion, by serious people. These are articles in academic journals, and these are articles in popular newspapers like the New York Times. And to see this in popular culture is, for some people, they might say, "Oh, look, they, if only, they stood in the right path." But to me, it shows an upswelling, to kind of quote Reb Tzadok, who, kind of couched the entire article in. He talks about the theological significance of a zeitgeist, the theological significance of what's happening in the culture. And right now, we're in the culture where people are talking about a messianic revolution. It's not the one that Jewish philosophy talks about. It's one by computers and singularity and uploading your mind to different computers. I'm very heartened by that the world is asking really rich, important questions about what does it mean to be a human being. And the second thing that I think is taking place right now is that aside from a technological revolution, there is a mental health revolution, and they go hand in hand. There is a deep anxiety in the world right now, and it's not because of these, whatever you want to call them, fill in the blank, unprecedented times, difficult times, whatever you want to call them. It's unrelated to the pandemic, though it's certainly exacerbated by it. It's a sense of both purposelessness and a deep-rooted commitment that everyone should be able to find a purpose. It's connected to Instagram influencers and Twitter clout and that social media, that I want to contribute something to the world, and it's never been easier to do that. And if I don't seize the opportunity to do it, people feel purposelessness. And that's both unhealthy and healthy. It's unhealthy because, there's this angst of like, I feel worthless if I don't have followers, if I'm not a public personality, if I'm not a thought leader, all of these new titles, if I don't have big WhatsApp groups. But it's also healthy that people are asking themselves, what is the purpose of my life? I mean, when did we live in a time in history when people were talking about their personal brand, their personal narrative? I mean, these are all things that return to the central idea people are looking for purpose in their life. And that is where I think machshava, Jewish thought, or I would almost like cut off the Jewish machshava, thinking about life, really contributes and transforms the way people proceed through their lives, through difficulties, asking about, a God, asking about vis-a-vis a community and a nation and themselves. And I think that we're living in a really exciting time in our culture for the contribution of everything that Jewish thought offers.
I appreciate your optimism because I think, the thing that I mentioned in my introduction was something that both of you talked about, right? I talked about complexity, right? That we're living in a time where there's a lack of complexity and a lack of ability to have civil discourse. And by the way, the one person I didn't mention is Roy Finkelman, Yoel Finkelman, and he focused just on that idea of learning how to hold complex ideas. And I think that is a need of the time. And then I talked about the crisis for meaning as the two major, I think, to me, that is the zeitgeist. Those two pieces. And I had never thought about that piece. You're right. The Harari movement, right, or the AE movement. I had never put that piece in, but it fits as well, right? Like who are we as human beings? I just watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix about
on my list.
Right, it's worth watching. It's exactly, a lot of it is this issue. How much agency do we have? How much is our humanity being stolen from us without us even realizing that it's happening, right? How much are we ceding our ability to really think independently and live independently without even realizing it? So I agree with you, and I do think that I happen to think that machshava is the answer, or is an answer, for both the reasons that you said, because it encourages complex thought, it encourages space for divergent thought to coexist peacefully, and it also provides answers to meaning. I guess my next question that I would be interested in hearing from both of you. So what I mostly teach is Rav Soloveitchik and to a lesser degree Rav Kook. And I find that my students very much still respond to Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Kook. Certainly to Rav Soloveitchik, meaning, and I think this is actually something that Dr. Bronstein also said. He said that he's, for him personally, the modern philosophers speak more than the medievals. I find that certainly what I define as the existentialism of Rav Soloveitchik, the way he's discussing his own personal search for meaning and the answers that he finds, right? That language of the way that I'm thinking about the nature of reality is my personal interaction with reality. I think that's very relevant to today's students. And I think the answers that he gives, right? The answers about searching for meaning, I happen to even think his message about sacrifice, even though that's not language that's very popular in the modern culture, really speaks to people. The idea that you can't really have meaning without sacrifice, and the purpose of sacrifice is to create meaning. Mm-hmm. I still find that those types of messages resonate with my students. I'm wondering, however, because in a few forums where I've said that, where people say there's a crisis of, and by the way, I've also had students who have come to me with crises of meaning, who I've directed, even though my interest is less postmodern, it doesn't speak to me personally as much, but I've said, I think you should pick up Rav Shagar, because for you, I think that that's a place where you might find meaning, even though it doesn't for me. But the reason I'm mentioning that is because I think that there are people out there who are arguing, unless you do this very new stuff, right? Rav Soloveitchik and the Rambam, don't even talk about the Rambam and forget Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, they're not going to talk to today's students. I haven't found that to be true, not about Rav Soloveitchik, and I haven't found it to be true about Rav Kook either. I found that they still do resonate with my students, and I'm wondering what your experience is with that, whether you think we do need a new language, and again, I think Rabbi Nachman is an example of this, right? Rabbi Nachman I think he was one of the quote-unquote first postmodernists 200 years ahead of his time, in the fact that his whole philosophy is based on the idea of being in that existential place of doubt, right? He didn't try to find answers to the doubt. He teaches how to live in the doubt. So and again, that's very much, let's say, like Rav Dov's approach. So I'm wondering what you think about that. Do you think we really do need to find new language to focus on the new, these new types of, either new thinkers or thinkers who we can reinterpret for this new zeitgeist? Or do you think we can find the answers in the classics? Do you think there's some type of a meld? And what are you finding among your students? And do you do this with your students? Do you actually, because again, it's very easy for me. I teach, in a midrasha. They're there for meaning. It's not like it's an academic course. It's not like I have to cover, that's what they're thirsting for. So I don't have any, it's very natural to my curriculum, but is this something that you do? Do you feel like it's part of your mandate? And what do you find your students respond to? I'm very curious about this whole question of the zeitgeist and how machshava is in real time, relating to the needs of the zeitgeist.
Robert Sheffield, do you want to kick off on that one?
It's funny. The subject of my article, which is Jewish Thought, a Process, Not a Text, if I think I got the title correct, I don't feel any responsibility to present any individual thinker to people. I think that the people who I connect to, the thinkers, the ideas that I connect to are the ones that probably bubble up the most. But I don't feel like my responsibility as an educator is to teach Rev Cook's opinion on X, Rev Soloveitchik's opinion on Y, Rev Tzadok's opinion on Z. None of that do I look at as my mandate. I think my mandate is twofold, and this is what I do with my students. And I mean students, I don't think of it as like students like that hierarchical way. I think of students who I'm speaking to individually in a classroom or even through articles. What am I trying to do? And I think in a way, what it makes me think of is there's this beautiful quote from Jonathan Safran Foer in Everything Illuminated, where he talks about what the sixth sense of the Jewish people, that most people, he writes, have touch, taste, sight, smell, and hearing. He says the Jewish people have a sixth sense called memory, that the Jew is, when anybody else, the analogy he gives is when somebody gets hurt, everybody could talk about, what that hurt, you get pricked by a pin or something or get cut. You could say, what did it feel like? What this? And what he says, when a Jew encounters a pin and gets hurt, he asks, what does it remember like? And I think there's something deeply both spiritual, Jewish, and about machshava about that. And what do I mean by that? I'll present students with either formative texts. I'm talking about the Gemara, Maseches Brachos, Maseches Shabbos, or I'll talk to them about major seminal experiences, Hoshana Rabbah, Sukkot, Shavuos night, Purim. And what I'll basically try to do is ask them both on a national level and on an individual level, what do those experiences remember like? What are the memories that we have from those experiences? And part of that is nostalgia. Part of that is, kind of the jokes that I would make in my long-running column in Mishpacha magazine about, the different types of people at a Purim Suda. But part of it is trying to wed experience with ideas. And I do that both through talking about why Gemara is so difficult. Why is Maseches Shabbos so not spiritual? Why is, Maseches Bracha structured the way that it is? I think, what's his name? I'm trying to remember who wrote about this in the article. Somebody went through this wasn't an earlier article. It wasn't in this symposium. It may not even been in this journal. So I don't want to get in trouble for quoting him. He wrote a PhD on Maseches Sukkah. Former name is Genak. What's his new name? He Israeli.
Oh, Nagain, Yaakov Nagain.
Yaakov Nagain. He wrote about this once upon a time about how he teaches machshava. I wouldn't go word for word with what he does, but I like having students think about what has your Shabbos experience been? Did we just lose? what has your Shabbos experience been? Why is Shabbos feel so stressful? And what is both the halachic, but I think more importantly, the machshava implications of why that is so? And basically allowing people to wed their personal experiences, our national experiences as a nation. How have we responded to a Yom Kippur through Jewish history, through all the texts, and start to build a personal memory that these students can have with these seminal texts, the Gemara, and seminal events, our Yom Tovim, our Shabbos, and all of the like. And I think that is where I feel the most responsibility, to give them language to articulate the meaning of their own lives.
You consider that studying machshava? I would guess that from your piece, your answer would be yes, because you
absolutely.
That's how you define
going through a
machshava.
Maseches Gittin or Maseches Shabbos, and asking, why is Maseches Shabbos so tedious? Why does it spend so much time on it? Why doesn't it read? And I wrote an article like this for Tablet. Again, it's a different audience, but I think it's machshava. And asking, why doesn't this read like Abraham Joshua's the Sabbath? Like, what happened here? Were they not able to have that soaring eloquence of what happened to the palace in time? Why are we talking about the shiurim, the minimal size for carrying out a cloth napkin in your pocket? And I think those are questions that speak to the phenomenology of what it means to engage in Judaism, and giving language to articulate the meaning from those experiences is the process that I am trying to highlight in what is at its core Jewish thought, machshava.
Really fascinating. And I think I would ask Dr. Reinhold, I'd like to hear your answer, but I would like to ask you if you think Rabbi Beshefkin is engaging in traditional study of machshava, because you're coming from an academic perspective. So I don't want to hear your answer too, but I'm interested in that as well.
Yeah, well, I guess I can start with that just because I'm aware that I do something quite narrow, right? It's called Jewish philosophy. It is distinct purely from an academic disciplinary perspective, maybe from the kind of thing that the Rabbi Beshefkin's talking about, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's not something that I do and I value. It's just that I can't set it for somebody to get an MA for, right? So and I think I said in my piece, using my Beatles analogies as I would, that you don't have to have necessarily the formal discipline of philosophy in order to write great machshava, right? And then philosophers might do what they do with it, which might, in the way, as I again said, the way that lawyers will write very long contracts for something very simple, just to explore all the ins and outs. But the spark of the idea and the genius idea can come from any study like Rabbi Beshefkin was talking about. So it's not what I do, but that's merely a function of, my job. So it's certainly not something I in any way am kind of denigrate, dismissive of at all. It's something that I do myself. I just wouldn't necessarily do it in my classroom. So yeah, that's it in terms of that question. I think it's very interesting, actually, that your question was about, do we need a new language, and who doesn't speak to people? And Rabbi Beshefkin went back to classical texts in terms of that's where he grounds it. And I think that's actually precisely why somebody like a Rav Soloveitchik speaks to people more than a Rambam when it comes to philosophy. Because if you read the guide, it doesn't read as particularly steeped, right? Even though we know the Rambam's absolutely steeped in that, the guide itself, qua philosophical writing, is much less so. And very often when you introduce people to medieval rationalists, they see that immediately and they wonder, but hold on, how on earth does that match up with what it says in the Torah? With Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Kook as well to an extent, you read it and it's far closer, just in the mere way it's written and presented, to classical texts and to a sugya, for example. And I think that's interesting because that's kind of what we've always done. right? I often quip that you don't realize until you start going to, you know, friends' weddings and Sheva Brachot, that every parsha is actually about getting married, right?
Mhm.
If you get the Devar Torah there, and it'll be this way, oh,
That's
you mean
right.
the parsha is about marriage? But there's something brilliant about that, right? Because it's precisely because we have always grounded our contemporary responses in our Masorah, in the classical texts. That's what makes it speak to people, right, who are searching within, from within. And then, of course, there are those who are maybe less, you know, less open to that approach. And because I have to teach people who you know, run the gamut, some of whom I think are great and some of whom I don't necessarily, but you never know what will speak to somebody, right? I got into this because somebody was teaching me the Kuzari. I'm not a big kind of Kuzari guy, but and nor was he. But that was the thing that sparked it, because, wow, this is fascinating. I had no idea that there were these things out there. So I think that developing the new languages is important, but in the way that Rabbi Beshevkin was saying, it's precisely when it's grounded in the classical texts that it can maybe speak more to certain constituencies. It's ironic, I'm teaching a course at the moment at Revel, which is a course on Spinoza and Mendelssohn. It's the biggest course I've taught in years. I think it's partly due to Zoom and the pandemic, but you know, it's just interesting where people find things of interest. And even I met somebody who became interested in Judaism because of reading Spinoza, of all things. So you never quite
It was
know.
the first course I ever took with Dr.
Right,
Reinhold.
that's the one you mentioned. Yeah.
I believe that's the first course.
So yeah, I think that you never know what will click with somebody. I do think that there are certain thinkers that more naturally speak to, say, our constituency in modern orthodoxy, who are yeshiva trained, because they're in their own way and using philosophy, doing the classic midrashic thing of using those texts and then bringing out something that is of contemporary relevance. And just one other thing I'll add, actually, in terms of its ability to speak to people today. I met with a school administrator relatively recently, and we were just chatting, and this person quite high up in one of our yeshiva high schools, and he was talking to me about the fact that he's getting students coming in asking questions that he can't answer, because they're of this ilk and interested in potentially setting something up where they would have some kind of, you know, machshava Jewish philosophy, but something, just because the kids have questions that need answering, and he felt that he wanted to be able to answer them in a sophisticated way. So whether for him to study or to have someone, you know, who is sensitive to these types of, to the needs of, and the level of people at a certain age, which you know, is not to be taken lightly in terms of, you know, what you should and shouldn't just, you know, throw out to people. But it's clear that he felt that there was a thirst and a need to speak to them in this type of language that will address those questions, and that was just, you know, interesting to me.
Yeah, I love that idea of machshava as always coming back and grounding itself in traditional texts. And that makes me think again, right, Rabbi Shefkin, of when you talked about Yishai Ribo. Yishai Ribo can be seen as modern machshava, but I think you're right. Why is Yishai Ribo so popular? I don't think it's just because he's a good musician. I think it's because you used the phrase modern day Midrash. I think you're the one who used that phrase, and I think that's why it is. I think it's because he's really touching on very deep. I also loved your image of the, you know, speaking to memory. What's resonating with people right now? What are the issues that are resonating with people right now? And he's marrying that into traditional text. That's what he's doing. He's playing with our class. That's such a beautiful idea, and I think it's very true. And I do wonder if that resonates more for people, like when they can feel grounded in tradition and in text, and yet still at the same time feel like it's answering today's questions, whether that convergence is the most powerful. That's really interesting. So I'd be interesting about this Mendelssohn Spinoza, because I don't know if you consider that less grounded, more grounded. It's an interesting question. I think that I love that idea of anchoring the modern issues in the classical as being this bridge. I also, one of the things that you said, Dr. Reinhold, that reminded me, Rabbi Wiederblank, who I think of the pieces was very much, perhaps even the most, coming from, he's a Rosh Yeshiva, he was coming from a very traditional place. And he said a few things that I found profoundly moving, actually. One was like, nobody talks about God. When we're teaching Machshava, like he wasn't afraid to answer, what do you think we should talk about? His answer was, we should talk about God. We should talk about what God means, which I found quite fascinating. And he's definitely going back to the traditional text. But he also talked about, is there a limit to what we teach and what we don't teach? And he said, which, as a traditional Rosh Yeshiva, I thought it was a wonderful thing to hear him say. He said, our obligation is to teach our students how to live with questions also. If I don't have an answer to every question, part of Machshava, and I think there is a thing in Jewish thought, even the Rambam, right, who's maybe, par excellence, the most, you had to choose the most, well, maybe you could go a little farther than him, but within the basic canon, certainly on the far edge of rationalist thought, but even the Rambam recognized that at a certain point, reason ends and faith begins. I mean, you could have a conversation about how, where the Rambam says that, but I think it's a fair statement. And I think that's also very necessary for today's world. And if we go back to Rabbi Bashevskin's talking about the nature of humanity and artificial intelligence and computers and supercomputers, and do we have boundaries as human beings? The idea that we can accept limitations and accept no's and no's as in, limits, and learning how to live with the discomfort. Also, living with discomfort, I don't think, is a very modern idea. So living with discomfort, living with the discomfort of questions, I think is also a very powerful message that I think emerges from Machshava. And I think what both of you are saying is triggering in me that all of these things really do come out of our texts. They really do come. I do believe that the study of Machshava is crucial. Yeah, and I guess I appreciate what you're saying, because what you're saying is you can do it in many different ways, and it will speak to many different types of people, but the enterprise is actually, and maybe this is true of all of Jewish study, right? It's something very unique to Jewish study, that it has, that's the whole beauty, I think, of the dynamic of Torah Shebachtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh, that it has at once the rigidity and the tradition, and yet the flexibility. And that's really maybe a gift. All right, so I don't want to keep you. I know that some of you have places to go and things to do, but any last thoughts or any last concluding words or ideas about just, I don't know, but maybe, again, Dr. Reinhold, your whole piece was on this, but how Machshava changed your life, or what it means to you, just to kind of round off this conversation, which I've enjoyed very much. So,
Yeah, there was something you just said that was that spoke to me. I guess two things. Number one, part of this, and the reason maybe that you said Rav Soloveitchik speaks to people, because he is probably of many of the modern thinkers, and especially those really grounded in our tradition, in the way he writes, that is one of those who really is very happy to talk about discomfort being a part of the essence of the religious life rather than answers. So maybe part of the reason he speaks to people is that. On the other hand, I think there are people who need more than that and want answers, and that's where what you put out there, and putting out different views, some that do give those answers that may or may not speak to you, and some who are happy to live with the tension, maybe is important, and it matters that people are aware that both options are there, that you can have the answers or live with the tension. And there are people who are running through certainly modern thought, and way before that, who will give you those options. And the one other thing, just to probably the last thing from me, you spoke about the study of it, right? Now, I don't know this, but I'm wondering if there's another traditional religion where study, Talmud Torah, is valorized as worship, right? As in not getting the answers, just studying, right? That's something I don't know. I wouldn't want to say it's unique to Judaism because I don't know, kind of, but I think there's something very powerful in that, right? It's that the process of study is actually something that's a mitzvah, right? Whether you get the answers out that study or not, right? You might, and some people might at certain points, and some people might not at certain points, but it's the study of it that is itself meaningful, right? The whole thing about it's the search, right? The journey rather than the end. I think there's something very significant about that, that maybe also will speak to people in our contemporary age.
Yeah. That's a shout out to Jeffrey Sachs, who kept saying to me, why isn't anybody saying we study Machshavet Yisrael because it's Talmud Torah and we have to like, he was like waiting for somebody. And I think people did allude to it, but I think you just said it very beautifully. Yeah. Okay. Rabbi Shefkin, last word.
I felt my only addition is something that I felt I missed, and I think really the symposium missed in a way, and that is one category of Jewish thought that I've been more and more interested in lately. It's never been a central part, and that is Jewish storytelling. Starting with again, most famously, Rabbi Nachman stories. I'm learning more and more of the contemporary Makubal, Rav Itchemeyer Morgenstern's Torah Yama Chachma, and the way that a lot of seminal, not all, but a lot of seminal thinkers use storytelling. It leaves me with a question that I wish somebody, and perhaps myself, would have addressed, because I think it relates to the central theme. Why do we tell so many stories? And I would include in this non-Mekubal, I would include in this Rav Herschel Schachter. If you sat in his shiur, and Zev Elef wrote an article about this many years ago in the in Ritz's kind of like weekly publication, Rav Schachter as Magid, as a storyteller. And I think there's something very powerful, beautiful, and theological taking place with why we couch so many of our richest ideas in the form of stories. On the most basic level, people will say it's to kind of give you reverence for the rabbis of previous generations. That obviously doesn't apply to a lot of Rabbi Nachman stories because they're not based on any actual nonfiction. They're fictional characters. I think what it's trying to do is teach you the interpretive power of analogy, the interpretive power of seeing your own life and the concepts with which you interact with manifest through analogy, where you could take stories about God and ideas about God like the Rambam does and apply that to a marriage and vice versa, where you could talk about struggles of a lost prince or a lost princess and then see something in your own life that manifests that, and training people to have that analogous type thinking, that interpretive ability to recast their own personal story, our national story, and the way that we relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kudsha Baruch Hu, Kiviyachol himself. I think a lot of this is powered through our interpretive ability to create those analogies and see abstract concepts manifest in our lives. It reminds me of Douglas Hofstadter, the grandfather of modern computer science thinking and consciousness studies, has a wonderful book called Surfaces and Essences, which is about the power of analogies as the fuel, as the engine that powers our humanity, the ability to create those types of analogies. And I think there's something deeply Jewish, deeply spiritual, and a really central part of Machshava that is told through stories. And even just asking that question of why storytelling became such a central part of the medium through which we express Machshava is something that I wish I had addressed in some place, but it's definitely something worth thinking about. And I think it relates to some of the themes that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think you're very right. I think
Rabbi Soloveitchik also is, definitely uses stories a great deal. As you were saying, Rabbi Soloveitchik uses stories all the time. How, the Great Baltic Sea Reb Chaim staring off
That's
the
right.
balcony. Even asking what do we need this to? It's to perk up the reader. Like,
Yeah,
what is this for? I
absolutely.
think there's
And
something much richer going on there.
yeah, it's beautiful. He says, like, Jewish history is telling stories. It's a teacher telling stories to children. And what you said about memory before, I think very much resonated with me. And also I think about archetypes, right? When you talked about analogies and Rabbi Nachman, I think it's like hitting human archetypes. And I love what you said about learning how to do that ourselves. It's such a rich idea, learning how to cultivate the active intellect, or whatever you want to call it, not the active intellect, the imagination, the imaginative faculty. That's beautiful. And there's so much more that,
Just probably worth throwing in as well is that, of course, all the way back, Plato thought the most important truths had to be taught through parables rather than directly. So there's, something to that idea of interpretation of stories and parables being touching higher truths that maybe pure, discursive thought can't, that has a very long pedigree in philosophy.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, well, I just want to thank you both so much. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for having this conversation. I found it extremely enriching.
And thank you for your
Pleasure.
amazing work on this symposium.
Yeah,
Really,
thank you for having us.